good.
Hey, Jerry.
Good morning, Arvind.
Good morning. So good to see you. Hello, Fred.
Oh, I see.
Hello.
Rana. I see Matt.
Jerry.
There's Horst, there's Jerry,
That's joining us from Bolivia.
there's Emily.
It's like a family reunion.
We're still learning our way into this. Remember, we were to have had 3 or 4 days in El Paso on that sacred, extraordinary ground as a unconference. What we've done instead are these unzooms, and in many ways, I find them to be better than we probably would have experienced in many ways. We've learned a lot, and we're still learning our way about what are the limits of technology that lets us come into each other's lives so that we can help us be present to the communities that we live in and care about.
Dr. Sunny Anand, an LCLI fellow. And of course the general theme was from inequity to equity. And that will continue today with a conversation that Jim would have with Horst. In 1959, when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta King arrived in India for the first time, the land of Gandhi, and at the airport, Dr. King was asked, how is it to be in the land of Gandhi? And King said that to other countries, I go as a tourist. To India, I come as a pilgrim. What is a pilgrimage? I've been to a pilgrimage to Montgomery, Alabama, to the Rosa Parks Museum, standing at the exact same spot where Rosa Parks was booked, because she chose to, again, sit in a certain place on a bus and chose to much rather go to prison than to move backward. Jim knows this, that the first few times I went to South Africa in the early 90s, I had to go to Pietermaritzburg train station, because in June of 1893, that's the train station where Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, a 23-year-old lawyer, was thrown off a moving train with all his luggage because he had a first-class ticket, and it was, the brown skin and his perception of being a coolie, which led to that great injustice. Of course, now there's a little museum in the waiting room of where Gandhi sat on a wet and windy night, shivering, and of course has called it one of his sort of most transformational moments. Given we have Horst today in conversation, and again, Jim knows about this, I've been to Robben Island, taking the ferry from the waterfront in Cape Town. And it just so happened to be that the first time I was on that ferry, I was sitting next to Ahmed Kathrada, one of the close associates of Madiba, Nelson Mandela, part of the Rivonia Nine. And I remember arriving by this ferry at Robben Island to then sit on a bus. And the tour guide began by saying, my name is so-and-so, and I was a prisoner at Robben Island. And I would like you to experience this place from the perspective of my eyes. And what a moment that was, when the bus stopped at the limestone quarry. And as we all got out at Robben Island, he said, this is the world's biggest university campus, because as the Mandelas and the Sisulus and the Kathradas and others dug for limestone and carried it from here and there, they were also in some ways enhancing and educating each other. So these are sites, these sites of pilgrimage were based on color, creed, and I would even use the word crass ideologies. The Gandhis and the Parks are publicly humiliated, subjugated, physically violated, chained, imprisoned, and yet these are also sites which helped build resolve, which helped build character. These are the sites which became the centers of cascading hope, of cascading connection, and building of cascading movements. Of course, these took time. These are sites which in some ways speak what Abe Lincoln said were to our better angels of fairness and equity and equality and our common humanity. It's interesting, in 2000, when Mandela arrived in New Delhi, 49 years after King's pilgrimage and 103 years after Peter Maritzburg, to receive the Gandhi Peace Prize, he acknowledged the significance of Peter Maritzburg. He said, in 1893, you gave us a lawyer by the name of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. And 21 years later, when that was the length of Gandhi's tenure in South Africa, we gave you back a Mahatma. From a 23-year-old lawyer to a 44-year-old Mahatma, who then, of course, went back to India and did things. A few years ago, when I was in Prague, I of course had to visit the Václav Havel Library, the last president of Czechoslovakia and the first president of the Czech Republic, and the one who initiated the Velvet Revolution. And when I walked away from the Václav Havel Library, again, a place of pilgrimage for me, I took with me, based on Havel's writing, was that it's humiliation and subjugation in some ways that builds humility. It is something that builds character. And ultimately, I think the question for all of us is not, why were we not Gandhi, or why were we not Mandela, or why were we not Havel? I think the question for us is, why were we not we? Why was I not Arvind? And I think that is the quest that brings us together.
Thank you for that beautiful framing. You always set the stage for us so lovingly and beautifully. I'm going to introduce Jeremy Moseley, who's going to share with us a narrative about equity and justice related to the eugenics program in North Carolina. Jeremy is a wonderful human being. He's the Associate VP of Faith Health here at Wake Forest. Prior to that, he worked at another academic medical school and public health. And he's a lifelong North Carolinian, and he's got a very unique voice to tell this story for us.
Thank you, TC, for that introduction. And thank you, Arvind, for that beautiful framework for today. I'll begin by speaking to British scientist Sir Francis Galton. He's an interesting individual. He created the statistical concept of correlation and widely promoted regression toward the mean. He was the first to apply statistical methods to the study of human differences and inheritance of intelligence. He introduced the use of questionnaires and surveys for collecting data on human communities. He coined the phrase nature versus nurture. His book, Hereditary Genius, was the first social scientific attempt to study genius and greatness. He founded psychometrics and differential psychology. He devised a method for classifying fingerprints useful in forensic science. He conducted research on the power of prayer, concluding it had none due to its no effects on the longevity of those prayed for. He researched the optimal method for making tea. He devised the first weather map. He invented the Galton whistle for testing differential hearing ability. He was Charles Darwin's half-cousin. Finally, he was also the pioneer of the field of eugenics and coined this term in 1883. Galton defined eugenics as the study of all agencies under human control, which can improve or impair the racial quality of future generations. Supreme Court case Buck versus Bell, which in an 8-1 decision made forced sterilization for eugenic purposes legal in the United States. Oliver Wendell Holmes was on the court when the case was tried and wrote the majority opinion. He stated, "It is better for the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit for continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting fallopian tubes." He declared that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. The Eugenic Board of North Carolina was formed in July 1933 by the North Carolina State Legislature. Over time, the board shifted its focus to include sterilizations. Their original purpose was to oversee the practice of sterilization of public funded institutions that were judged to be mentally defective or feeble-minded by authorities. The majority of these sterilizations were coerced. Academic sources have observed that this was not only the ableist and classist project, but also a racist one, as African Americans were targeted. Of the 7,686 people who were sterilized in North Carolina, after 1933, 5,000 were African American. In contrast to other eugenics programs across the United States, the North Carolina Board enabled county departments of public welfare to petition for the sterilization of their clients. The board remained in operation until 1977. William Lewis Poteet, former president of Wake Forest College, was an early and vocal supporter of the eugenics movement. He embraced it long before others and stood by it long after many others backed off. Even the Winston-Salem Journal, which would be a significant force in illuminating North Carolina's past eugenics abuses in the modern era, was not immune. In 1948, the newspaper published an editorial entitled "The Case for Sterilization, Quantity versus Quality," that went into the great detail of extolling the virtues of breeding for the general public good. However, the journal came in full circle in 2002 when a series against their will exposed North Carolina's forced sterilization program. The journal's revelatory investigation was the catalyst for an 11-year campaign to financially compensate victims. The 5-step plan lay dormant until 2008, when the committee was actually appointed, but the funding was not set up until after State Representative Larry Womble co-chaired this committee in 2010. No money was awarded until after 2016. To date, around 220 persons received roughly $45,000 by 2019. In 2019, House Bill 534 was also passed to allow those whose sterilization was ordered at county versus state level to file for compensation as well.
It's hard to quite know what to say after all of that, except to reflect on that. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you for this opportunity.
Although, in fact, it fits very well with what, Jeremy, you have just shared. Now going to move to the interview with Horst. And as a national student leader in South Africa, he already engaged in actions that signal his long commitment to justice. He, contrary to state policy, had a black speaker address students at the white university campus he attended. He distributed critical articles to black campuses that weren't supposed to go there. And he helped lead a march to John Foster Square police station, where many people were detained and some were killed, where Winnie Mandela and 20 others were being held without charge or trial. And for that, he was arrested and he was found guilty under what was called the Riotous Assemblies Act. After his studies, Horst began to work for the Christian Institute of Southern Africa under the Reverend Beyers Naudé, a dissident white Afrikaner who had upset both his church and the government for, so to speak, betraying his people in going into resistance. Here he also met and had regular contact with Steve Biko, the founder of the Black Consciousness Movement, and later, when Winnie Mandela was imprisoned for 6 months for banning her breaking order, she and Nelson appointed Horst as the legal guardian of their 2 daughters. In 1974, Horst was arrested again, this time under the notorious Section 6 of the Terrorism Act, and he spent 73 days in solitary confinement without charge before being released. Then he was tipped off that he was to be rearrested, so he fled into exile, flown to Botswana, undetected in a light aircraft piloted by his Christian Institute colleague, the Reverend Cedric Mason. And in exile, Horst took over the Christian Institute's external office in Utrecht in the Netherlands. And it's actually there that I first remember meeting him. He picked me up at the airport in his fancy car of that time, a Citroen CV. It was a hairy drive. In 1977, the Christian Institute, together with all the Black consciousness organizations, was banned. Horst, now in exile, unusually as a civilian, addressed the United Nations Security Council on the armed struggle to overthrow apartheid. And now, in London, he began to work with the International Defence and Aid Fund. This is a fund which covertly provided legal representation for political detainees or trialists in South Africa. And when its founder, the Canon John Collins of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, died, then Horst took over the International Defence and Aid Fund, among other things helping organize the huge international tribute concerts at Wembley Stadium in calling for the release of Nelson Mandela. After returning to South Africa, free South Africa in 1990, Horst received the Austrian Bruno Kreisky Prize for Services to Human Rights and receiving a knighthood from the King of Sweden for his role in IDAF. Back home now, if the apartheid state had thought that he was fishy, he was now appointed by the new government as the senior civil servant in the fisheries ministry, responsible for fisheries, a big industry in South Africa. And his job was to deal with corrupt practices and to find an equitable system of fishing quotas, which up till then had been the preserve of white people. Horst was born in Namibia, and he comes from a family of missionaries to Namibia, German missionaries, one of whom married a woman of Khoi origin, a fact long repressed until Horst himself recently traced this side of his family line and brought them together in 2 meetings in Namibia, hoping for a different kind of future. Horst now lives in a classically white neighborhood in the Cape Peninsula, not far away, where he is very active, part shack settlement called Masiphumelele, surrounded by affluent white housing estates, which you see at the top end of the picture, that draw domestic and other labor from the township. This is a situation, of course, of deep inequality and continuing injustice. Horst not only faces this double whammy as a responsible citizen, but he does so too as a privileged white person who willy-nilly benefited from apartheid. He has paid a price for his activism throughout his adult life. That's pretty clear, I guess, including detention in solitary confinement and a long exile. But he remains highly conscious of these ambiguities and the contradictions that mark them all. Given the context I've just described, Masiphumelele, that disparity and inequality, you've talked about what it means to be a white, well-off neighbor, or ubu mwane, to Masiphumelele Township. What does it mean to be a neighbor in that sense? Thank you so much for agreeing to do this and for being with us for this to happen.
Thank you everybody for being present today. Now just 2 facts around it. Masiphumelele is in the aftermath of apartheid, 26 years later, still is housing for poor people and entirely for Black people. And that serves as a cheap labor reservoir for the middle-class suburbs that surround it on all sides. The second point to take note of is that there are 40,000 people who live in Masiphumelele, and the space allocated to them is not more than 2 square kilometers. I live as part of the valley in which Masiphumelele exists, and we live on 40 square kilometers. This is to accommodate the large estates. This is to accommodate the swimming pools. This is there to accommodate riding ranges and more and more. I could not conceive of a situation where I am fighting apartheid and then end up ignoring apartheid just because 1994 came and we had democratic elections, because I maintain that Masiphumelele remains in a state that is determined by wealth, white wealth, substantially, overridingly, and by the acceptance by an old order and a new order that if this is the way it is, let it be. And I cannot accept that circumstance. So I chose the word ubumelwane, which is an isiXhosa word. Simply translated, it means neighbor or neighborhood. But in isiXhosa, it means much more. It means a neighborhood. If you are a neighbor, you are a caring person. You are exercise concern for those who are in your neighborhood. And so my task is to see how best I can ensure that there is an act of solidarity, an act of support for what changes the basic issues that underlie this ghetto, or this area that is ghetto-like, which is partly fenced in by social dimensions, by highways which are designed in such a way that the people there are congested into an area. My argument with the city council, controlled by the opposition to the ruling party, the ANC, they are controlled by the Democratic Alliance, have done no better in regard to resolving the apartheid geography of our area. And even under COVID, land has not been made available, and people therefore cannot exercise social distancing in any fashion or form because they live in the most dismal, appalling shacks. The people in that area are going to be the subject of poverty and hunger, as they are already, for a period that will go much, much further than the COVID, even if COVID is the dominant factor with us for the next 18 months or 2 years. The South African economy has a very, very slim chance of coming out better economically after this. I have a fear we have missed a boat because partly our government has not taken education seriously for the past 26 years, and I could go on and on about other factors. But I hope that paints the picture.
I think that's a pretty clear picture, and it may be specific in some ways to South Africa, but obviously by no means restricted to South Africa. I include rich countries in that non-exceptionalism as well. But you've also said that there's a huge amount of pouring of charity, of philanthropy, if you like, or whatever you want to call it, under COVID-19 that has come from those who are better off, mainly white, but not only, but mainly. You've also indicated, to me at least in private, that you don't think this is adequate at all. Can you talk a bit about that?
We need to not do that by doing more good acts for them. It does not mean extending my hand again and again and again and saying, here's more bread. That may be absolutely necessary when COVID bites at its hardest. I understand that. I'm not questioning that, but I am saying something else. It turns out that the system has not changed for the majority of the people. Change in this country can only come about if we accept and understand that in one part, the super rich, the part that makes us so unequal, shed, give, depart with something, leave something. To me, the people who have to exercise their ubumelwane in this area, together with the people from Masiphumelele, need to go to the authorities and say, why is it that the wealth gap in South Africa is the harshest, the widest in the world, and Masiphumelele being a concrete example of that? At the moment, we have hand-wringing, we have concern expressions, and we have, in my neighborhood, soup kitchens. And people go out in the mornings and buy groceries and then cart the soup to Masiphumelele. And I do not participate in this. I find this entirely the wrong way of structuring the way we need to go. I think it ignores and fails to begin to understand the Black Lives Matter debate that is globally taking place at the moment. It hasn't come to South Africa in any substantive way that any white folk, any of the affluent folk are picking up their ears and saying, there's something we need to listen to here. Instead, there is on WhatsApp self-congratulation about all the wonderful work we are doing. And that includes words such as, and we must look forward to a better way in which we live together in the future. But I have a fear these are empty words and we are not going to go anywhere. And I worry deeply about this. Masiphumelele has also been the victim of huge mass fires, destroying homes for 800, 2,000 people at a time. And this has happened over the past 10 years. So if the dispensation, despite non-governmental organizations, despite non-profit organizations, notably churches, the biggest and largest one being the Baptist Church, if for 26 years the situation of the people in that area is not improving and is getting effectively worse, what is the point of being there? What are we doing? Why are we not changing that situation? Is this something that is going on forever and ever? We come from a revolutionary struggle. We wanted a different system. So for me, the issue has been that, if anything, I must support at this stage the voice that comes from Masiphumelele. And I want to do that with the benefit of what Steve Biko taught me. Steve Biko was at his prime, and I sustained my friendship, difficult as it was, with him in the period when he said, "Black man, you are on your own." I think that was very powerful and important. Masiphumelele, you are on your own. You need to stand up if you want change. But that does not exonerate me. And I have had to spend much time in my life finding the voice that says, if I am not part of you, how can my words lead to an expression of solidarity that means something?
Where do you see life emerging? Where do you see the positive deviance emerging? And what does it mean for us?
For me, the expression of solidarity means that the ubumelwane, the people around here, small as we are, few as we are, we need to stand up and go to the sub-council municipal meetings and say, we also don't want this geographic dispensation, this land allocation, this discriminatory way in which you are conducting the affairs in that area. So empowerment to attain a voice in my area must be, to me, the most valuable way in which I can engage to have a voice.
You're talking about yourself as a neighbor. You've also been the head of many significant institutions, as are many people on this call, in some significant influential role in an institution. Do you have anything to say to that beyond just being a neighbor?
The very reason I'm participating is because I am not there to deal with the systems, but with the people who are in it, and that is you. could say to you that there was a part of my life where I said, I actually don't care for the United States. That for me is a wasted engagement. I'm wrong when I say that. But there is a big difference. And I want to throw that out as a challenge. And that is, for us, the concept of systemic change looms far larger than I see the words that are used by my American counterparts. You can, maybe rightly or wrongly, it's not for me to judge, affect change within a system where you say, if the inequities of this or that are improved, then a better dispensation will happen. I cannot take any institution here at the moment without talking to something that is likely to affect something far more radical. And that is likely to come about only by massive social upheaval, organization, and challenge. And I want you to appreciate that fundamental difference, because that is how I perceive it and how I see the American situation. Incidentally, my rude remark about America is that, and please don't see yourselves as insular only because it is your foreign policy that causes the rest of us in the world to be largely being saddled with inequitable systems. It is American business in South Africa, it's the arms industry, it is foreign policy in all its ways.
Thank you, Horst. Evance, are you there? Before you begin, I want people to know that you are from Zambia, but served at the University of Cape Town and live there in many capacities, professor of employment law and social security, and that you're currently chairperson of the International Labour Organization Committee on the Freedom of Association.
It's very difficult to follow a remarkable legend, because that's what Horst is, and sang as he is. I first came to know of Horst when he was, as you mentioned, he was in the fishy business. He was sort of persuaded to preside over that process of trying to empower people across the board, and ended up, and this is the irony, ended up being a victim of the very corruption that he had been charged to try and clean up. And in fact, at that time, I was teaching equity classes, affirmative action, sort of popularly known, comparing systems, the US, South Africa, and India, and Canada, and so forth. And his approach caused quite a bit of interesting debate in the class. That's when I came to know of him. I did not meet him until last year, Jim, at your and Renata's place. And the thing about Horst's approach, my sense is that it underlines the power of individual agency in pursuit of leading causes of life. I slightly disagree with him that you can't, as an individual, if that is what I heard him to imply, make a difference. Because you see, the struggle in South Africa, if you go back, it was sort of engendered not only by individuals like him who sacrificed and made a stand, but also by internal forces. I'm thinking here of the Black Sash movement, which was a movement of well-to-do middle-class white women who took a stand in terms of ensuring that Black people were empowered in some way, and as a voice that they gave to those who were excluded and disadvantaged. So for me, I think when you talk of agency in terms of pursuing and advancing leading causes of life kind of creed, I think the individual actions that people like Horst do, which is continue to be unsung, is very, very kind of powerful. It may not be heard up front, but as part of the new way to change the dynamics of what South Africa has become to try and reclaim at least the initial kind of, some of the initial promises and sort of ideals, individual agency is important. It's because, as some of you know, South Africa, for instance, if I take it in my field, that is the field of the workplace and employment, the field of the constitutional of the constitution of the country, it is one of the best advanced sort of constitutional democracies we have. The genius of South Africa was to borrow very meaningfully from Germany, the US, and other constitutional states, and put in place a sort of a kind of constitution that does not only affirm individual liberties, but also looked at the kind of issues that Horst has dealt with, how to be a good neighbor, how to sort of to utilize social protection for the disadvantaged and so forth. The problem is, and this is a problem with the International Labour Organization's kind of social justice agenda, is that you have these standards that, that are well-meaning, they are real, they are embodied in law, but the implementation is different, is difficult. Difficult for many reasons, not least because the state doesn't have that capacity, and the willingness, the political will to try and bring them into being. And it is the individual agencies that I think Horst best personifies, that makes a difference in terms of carrying the banner that leading causes of life can be sort of be pursued regardless of what the circumstances are, regardless of the constraints, which, as the host pointed out, I mean, if you look at these disparities and inequalities, they are huge. So that's my sense of it. Just to pay tribute to him, to thank heavens we have in South Africa people like him, individuals who, in spite of the disappointment, because this is the other coin, Jim, that in South Africa you have these people, white people, who fought very hard, honestly, sincerely, in sort of trying to bring about a changed society, and now they sit in great disappointment that not only the kind of issues they try to tackle, are worse, and they are worse in a democracy that supposedly was a revolution. So I thought I should just make those few remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Evans. Ivan Moya is Associate Professor, Department of Social Work in the College of Health Sciences, the University of Texas at El Paso, a native of the US-Mexico border, Kellogg National Leadership Fellow, and recently also inducted for civic leadership to the Women's Hall of Fame in El Paso. So Eva, can we have your comments?
For me, the take-home message is, how do we look at places that may be structurally unequal in its approach and its access to good and opportunity, but how do we build bridges to connect? And I think that that's what I'm hearing you say, that you have spent your life and continue to do so in building those bridges and relationships to solidify it and lift the consciousness of the community. How do we heal some of that history so that we can truly be the neighboring brother and sister that we need to be to each other? So that's sort of like the first key message. Then the second is a big question, which is, how do you engage communities that have been traditionally oppressed? And you do that with great humility, in a way that it's that you bring about dignity, but in a way that you also find resistance, because unless there is resistance, it's very difficult to wake up from the oppression. So how does one wake up in such a way that you take ownership of that process and you use that agency that has been stated so that you can begin to turn history around? I am reminded of a powerful poem by Lao Tzu. It's about going to the people. You live with them, you learn from them, you love them, you start with what they know, you build with what they have, and at the best leaders, when the work is done, the task is accomplished, the people say we did it ourselves. So the question is sort of like, how do we make sure that communities do for themselves what they're capable of doing, so that the consciousness, the voices are raised in such a way that they carry the agency and that they search to find that equality and that access that is so very much needed, especially at a time where people have been subject to so much poverty, and this poverty has been norm as the sort of like the ongoing reality of what they live. So the key here for me is how do we become really those agents of positive change? How do we do that in such a way that we either inspire and work with communities so that, again, communities can do for themselves? COVID has really sort of like unmasked what is so obvious and real, which is already the intersectionality of inequalities, of poverty, of how groups of people are already at the greatest advantages. But how do we use this time to stand up, to organize, to advocate, and to reclaim hope, and really influence the way that resources are being allocated? How do we do that in a way that it's fair, that is efficient? How do we use the data that we have? I don't think it's about soup kitchens. You know, of course we need to feed people, but most importantly, how do we feed the soul and feed the spirit so that we can embark in systematic change? And with that, I want to thank you and honor you for everything that you have done and people that you have inspired and movements that you have started.
What are the hard challenges? We've had some comment on that already. Add to that, what is the generative positive way forward? In a sense, echoing the interview with Horst, these are the two issues that emerge.
We have to live with that which is around us, but we cannot ignore the bigger picture. We live in that as well.
I want to put Jeremy on the spot, if I may, Jeremy. You got us started wonderfully this morning with wonderfully, but also disturbingly reminding us of some very difficult history in this country. And not limited to North Carolina, I have to say, as I sent you a little note about that.
Yeah, thank you for that.
What do you see as the biggest barriers for achieving better equality, fairness, really, in our society? And what's the path forward?
I do believe conversation is one of the solutions. It's not the only solution, of course, but I am encouraged by the level of intelligent discourse in our communities. But some voices are still not heard. If you can't get on the internet now and you don't have access to resources, given our current COVID environment, you can't participate in conversation with others who are making decisions. And so you still have a disconnect between class, ethnicity, race, culture that is still systemic across our country. So those are barriers that haven't gone away. But I will say the hope that I have is that people are trying to force the conversation, whether they are knowledgeable or not, whether they know the history or not, and whether they can articulate their feelings or not. They're at least jumping into the space. And that's something I haven't seen earlier in my lifetime. That's new to me. And I think that's a source of hope for going forward.
The murder of George Floyd, combined with the reality that a person of color is 2 to 4 times more likely to die, in some areas 6 times more likely to die from the pandemic, has really opened up a conversation about race in America that feels different from the other times in my lifetime. It doesn't feel comfortable, but it feels different. And I think that it has mobilized a wider demographic in our society to be engaged in that conversation. I find that painful but hopeful, I guess, at the same time.
Institutions are starting to do some self-reflection. I think we've always had individuals and movements give voice to this, but not our institutions. They've been silent. And now we're starting to see people trying to speak from that institutional background. And so that may be a part of it as well.
Jim, I think I'm responsible for putting Naiema on the spot because she's, as you know, from South Africa, and I thought it would be really interesting to hear her perspective.
I feel connected to that community because it's predominantly a colored community. And Jim knows in South Africa, I'm a colored. For me, I also feel the light at the end of the tunnel because of COVID-19. People were subconsciously aware that there were all this inequities that was out there, and we weren't touched by it. But COVID-19 has made it more visible, and it brought it to the fore so people could actually see and become more connected to reality as it is happening now on the ground. I at the same time want to say, like working, Jim knows I work in a community in Irajaville where there's lots of poverty, and for us working there, the first thing when we have meetings, we use Google Meet with the team. And for them, what was most important for them now was having food on the table, getting food. So we changed our way of engagement to mobilize different organizations for food parcels and getting supporting their own soup kitchens. And they themselves mobilized, not just us coming from the outside giving and handouts. So we worked with them so that they could mobilize themselves to get food, like soup ingredients from different organizations and even government structures. So we used a local network that we developed with them. Jim, you know, from the Scratch Maps project, from the asset mapping, we developed a network of care, and that network itself seemed to be blossoming within the communities. And with COVID-19 comes a lot of psychological challenges that emerged in schools. And so we have this WhatsApp group, and then we send links to the people in the community, and then they would send links. For me, being connected to that community and building bridges with the neighboring Nomzamo, because they also part of our network, which is supposed to be an African community. And so we've been networking together. These two communities are now working together where there's actual boundaries in terms of major roads that separate the communities. They've actually crossed those roads now because of COVID and the networking, which is a light for me. I see there's hope, and there is something happening, something positive.
What I'm hearing from Naiema is what I've also been reading from a lot of people in many parts of the world. Astonishingly wide range of people who are finding new ways of putting together what they haven't been able to put together for a long time, or pushing institutions in directions they have not wanted to go for a long time.
There is hope within this whole thing that people do take ownership, and they do try to do something and make a difference on their own, and not just us coming in from the outside and doing something.
And I think the critical issue is, and that for me is actually what's most critical about people in this Leading Cause of Life Fellowship or the positive deviance side is, so how do we make this something that's sustainable and not just temporary while COVID is threatening us? How does it become systemic? How does it become structural and not just temporary kind of, oh, that was a good time, pity we aren't there anymore?
I think one of the answers to that was just given by Naiema, and that is that the crises that we're facing are creating, of necessity, new alliances, some of which may be quite vigorous and will have staying power. At least that one can hope for that. I am seeing new alliances form. And a part of that too is the painful recognition that leadership actually matters a lot. And that the twin crises in this country of race and health, racial and health disparities, has really uncovered all too dramatically, I think, the inadequacy of a style of leadership that is insensitive.
I found it quite moving to listen to Horst, but I know quite well that we could interview every single one on the screen now, and and find a similar pathway that we're still struggling with, still finding our way, and in these calls, still finding joyful partners along the way. You know, it actually is not a delusion to imagine that we could be deviant, we could follow life, and we could find our way to live a life of integrity, to be integral in this work. So I just want to thank those of you who have sort of ridden this Zoomy technology. Jim, thank you for the extraordinary and I know very detailed preparations you did to make this quite intimate process happen.
You're a good leader. You listen to the people.
I wish we had more leaders like that.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Yes.
Hi, everybody.
Thank you.
Stay well.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you, Chris.
Sweet potato shoots. Bring your sweet potato shoots. Sweet potato shoots. Bring your sweet potato shoots. Sweet potato shoots. Bring your sweet potato shoots.
I'm learning such a lot here from everyone.